Hi everyone, Carousel Technology would like to welcome you to Digitizing Your Risk Management Framework. At this time, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. Larry Whiteside is the Chief Information Security Officer at RegScale. Travis Howerton is the co-founder and CTO at RegScale. And Russell Dayan is the Senior Solutions Architect for Caliber. I'm now going to pass the floor over to them.
Thank you, Maha. Really appreciate it. And we really appreciate each of you for joining today. So, our goal with these, and if you've seen these before, I tend to like to run my mouth and we have a lot of good questions and dialogue related to whatever the topic is. So today should be no different. And hopefully that each of you can find something, some nugget, some piece of information that you can take away from here and take back to your organization to be better tomorrow than you were today. So I'll start with this by introducing myself, Larry Whiteside Jr. I work at RegScale. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer and the Chief Run My Mouth Officer. So that's what I love to do. So I'm thankful to have a chance to do it. I'll let our two other panelists introduce themselves. Travis?
Sure. So I'm Travis Howerton. I'm one of the co-founders at RegScale and serve as the Chief Technology Officer. So I'll lead the RegScale R&D team here in Knoxville, Tennessee, that's building our compliance as code platform. By way of background, spent 20 plus years in the U.S. nuclear weapons program, where I retired as the Chief Technology Officer, took a deputy CIO position at Oak Ridge National Lab, and then led digital transformation globally for Bechtel. So a lot of time around RMF and compliance, and looking forward to this session. So thanks, Larry.
Great. Russell.
Good afternoon. My name is Russell Dayan. I'm a solution architect for Caliber Systems. We're an employee-owned management consulting and digital transformation company. In my current role, I support the Shift Left RMF initiative, which helps us automate a lot of our compliance work, as well as some of the continuous ATO type integration into a productized framework that works well with RegScale.
Great. Thank you, Russell. And a little bit of context for me. So I've been a CISO for longer than I care to count. I'm a lot older than I look. And I've been doing this security thing for a long time. So I want to start with a question like this. Why is the RMF important, and what are the challenges that people are running into today?
Well, maybe I'll get us started on that one. So the risk management framework kind of came along because in an ideal world, everybody would just do all the controls all the time for all the systems. From a security practitioner's perspective, that would be ideal. You could get risk as low as possible, but it's just not reality. Everybody's cost constrained on budgets. We have a lot of legacy technology that can't meet the latest, greatest controls. There's always got to be a tailoring process that goes where you kind of justify your security investment against the risks to the systems and the types of data you're protecting, and get alignment of business value to security outcomes and get that lined up. So that's what the RMF was intended to do, was to give you the ability to tailor controls that make sense based off the assets you're protecting, and to right size your security program, and to know that you could take the precious dollars the government gives you for security and put them on the most valuable stuff, and not necessarily peanut butter spread it trying to get all of the things. And so it allows you to focus more on security and less on compliance, was the goal of the RMF, and how you tie all that together.
Got it. So Russell, for you, is that the reason that the RMF was created and people are moving towards that versus like NIST 853 and some of the other more just solely control-based things? Is that what you're seeing?
I think so. I think the big portion of the reasons why it was created was also standardization of some of the controls, making sure that organizations have a consistent target they're working against. Having a list of standardized controls helps know what's what needs to be monitored. Maybe helps you with prioritization a little bit, solve some of the complexity challenges and getting started. If you have a more of a streamlined view onto the security controls, you can approach them maybe with a less of a learning curve. Standardizing some of the documentation, I think, is also a big benefit of the risk management framework. Of course, there are challenges associated with it, most of it being the resource intensity of the approach. You would have multiple artifacts that you have to prepare. And historically, these artifacts have been very time consuming to produce. A lot of times, we've heard the adage that a lot of the security people work primarily from a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, which also means that there is often a lack of real-time follow-up, and therefore, by the time you're done with the document, a lot of times it's already becoming obsolete. You need to start over. So, so having a standard framework helps in that respect.
So you bring up a couple of things there, right? So you talked about standardized controls, and Travis, you used the R word, right? Prioritizing risk, right? And I like to call it the R word because just like the F word, a lot of people don't like to talk about that. A lot of people don't like to talk with the R word, right? So how are we expecting organizations who don't really understand risk, haven't done risk well a lot, right? How do we get to the point of just having that risk-based understanding and risk-based conversation in order to then do some of the things that Russell talked about, align to these controls and do that? Because that's been a challenge of the industry, and every industry, whether it's public sector or private sector, for a long time.
I think in government, the problem I always had when I was in the weapons program is the data gets stale very fast in those Word documents and spreadsheets. And so then you issue data calls, people go collect data, it gets synthesized, it runs through multiple layers of management. By the time it gets to you, months have gone by, and you're looking at some point in the past that's 90, 180, 365 days in the past. And the problem is people are making decisions around risk based off what the paper says, but work as imagined and work as implemented are often very different. What's known as drift in sort of the security space. And so these things can decay as a function of time. And so I think the thing that's different and what you're starting to see with the rise of cloud and the API-driven economy is machines should just talk to machines about their state. This whole idea of creating Word documents and paper in Excel and doing all this by hand is increasingly going to become outdated. And so I think the key to understanding risk is having better data that's translated into information as close as real time so humans can make risk-based decisions. Instead of, I think most of the time humans are turned into gophers to go fetch information, and they spend 80% of their time fetching and 20% deciding, and we really need to flip that equation the other way around to take better advantage of our people and our data, and less the way we've always done it.
Okay, I like that. Russell, what's your perspective on that?
I think what Travis has said is perfect. One area I wanted to add is also the evolving threat landscape. I think we're basically dealing with larger systems comprised of many more components. We also have a lot of more automation tools at our disposal that help us assess and collect some of the risk data. Like Travis has said, it becomes there's probably a little bit of a cultural resistance from the teams that have to manually collect and act on that data. And any component of it that can be automated will assist the teams in spending less time doing the manual work and more time making the decisions, and hopefully also improving their quality of life type issues. Because the last thing everyone wants to do on their weekend is respond to some upcoming deadline to review some 3,000 line long spreadsheet which could possibly be automated, especially if you already have systems in place that collect that data, but you just don't have a very good interface between taking the output from those systems and correlating them against your security controls. So that's where there's a lot of opportunities in the market.
Yeah, I sit here and think about, the many times where I was coming into an organization as the CISO, and, I asked for certain data sets to try and get an understanding of our posture as it stood, and the amount of time that it would take to gather that data was just absolutely insane, right? And they'd give me this, well, here was our last risk assessment 9 months ago. Okay, well, how much of this have we done? Well, and they go gather more data. So on this data front, right, when we're talking about data, why is it we understand that data gets stale, right? Months and months go by, you haven't really done what you're supposed to do, and then next thing you know, you're hitting that time frame again where auditors are coming back. Why have we not gotten to this point of shifting this component left, right? What's been the hesitancy? What's been the hang up? Because if you look at the rest of security, security has really shifted left. If you look at development, it's all shifted left. There's a lot of automation happening everywhere except in this piece. What do we think that holdup has been?
I can take a first stab at that. I think some of the culture resistance comes from the regulators themselves. You know, agencies have an inspector general, they have auditors, they have internal audit. They expect to get an artifact, and that artifact's in Word or Excel. And so there's just a lot of work that goes into feeding that machine to make sure those audits go well, because it can be very career limiting when they don't, right? And so that's important. It's also, the government has really important information. You know, they have nuclear weapons data. They have designs for weapons for the military. They're trying to put people on Mars. They're protecting the grid. They're doing lots of things that are really important. So the data is very sensitive. So we should take this really seriously, but at the same time, the way we've always done it isn't going to work. And so I think what most of the folks we talk to are experiencing is it all feels worse. And everything's changing faster, which means the paper's decaying faster. And so if you look out to 2030, everything's going to be cloud-based. Everything's going to be serverless, ephemeral, AI-driven systems. And this idea you're going to document anything at all in paper becomes increasingly silly as a function of time. At the same time, the regulatory process causes you to create more paper to address the issues in your old paper, and you didn't have time to do it right the first time, and it just creates this pile-on effect combined with the speed of transformation that it's just not going to work. So our thesis is what industry needs and what government needs is a real-time API-driven compliance as code approach to basically innovate our way out of the program, where you can, out of the problem, where you can balance the need to have really good security data so you can make good risk-based decisions with balancing the cost of getting it and the accuracy of it and trying to make that equation work. And so I think those are the major dynamics we see that are causing a lot of the consternation with the current ATO RMF processes in place in government.
Okay, Russell.
I'm going to pull on the thread that Travis has introduced earlier, specifically about the cadence of both risk management framework processes as well as even authorization to operate processes. They seem to be very incremental in nature, with the assumption that you would submit your inputs, 1 year or 3 years at a time. And there seems to be not a lot of concern of what happens in between those increments. I think having the framework that lets you pull the data from multiple sources, give you real-time visibility of what is it you actually are you compliant right now at this minute based on the latest available information, and then be able to repackage that data and somehow pull it or push it into your compliance management system, whatever your organizational agency might use, might improve the quality of data and maybe enable some of the better decision making, so that if there are any known vulnerabilities because of changing threat landscape, for example, then you would be able to prioritize and react to them. And with the current implementation of risk management framework being more of an incremental process, it's not always a high priority to assess the security, the components of the security stance of this throughout the increment in the actual within the increments before the deadline for the next submission. So therefore, having a real-time visibility on your risks is a preferred approach.
So we've got our first poll out there. If everybody gets a chance to read through that and answer that. So I want to pull out a couple of things that you both alluded to. The first one is this automation piece, right? So there's this thing called CATO, right? That the government is about to mandate that it's going to have to happen at some point, continuous ATO. How realistic is it that organizations get there? And I think we've talked about the why, right? But how? I think people here want to understand, how do they do that? If they've been struggling thus far with just getting to the authorization to operate, how is it expected for them to get to this continuous component? of this continued data gathering, continued, ATO, continuous shifting left of moving and automating these things? What are some of the things that we can give people to take?
Yeah, I think the number one thing for me is just shifting mindset and approach. We talk a lot about the RegOps movement and bringing the principles of DevOps to compliance, that the way things have always worked won't solve for a future where everything's going to be different. So you've got to be open to change. The second is we need to let machines do what they're good at. And so machine readable standards like the work that this team and Dr. Iorga is doing with OSCAL, I think are foundational capabilities representing all the RMF artifacts as compliance, as code, and now letting machines feed into those models. So machines are talking to machines about their state. APIs are used to sort of sling important data back and forth and as close to real time as possible. And that humans can then look at dashboards, whether it's RegScale or other tools that kind of give you real-time insights into what's happening. And so that's where you really want to get, is where paperwork's self-updating, where the cost of getting data is as close to free as possible, where the data is as near real-time as possible, as accurate as possible. And if you can achieve those things, then you can use these humans that are highly trained in the government to make better decisions. Because I've yet to meet a government cyber person who doesn't know what they're doing. When mistakes are made, they tend to be made because of lack of data, lack of visibility, incorrect data being given about something. So you're operating on a bad assumption. Those are the things that increasingly cause humans to have problems. And so I think shifting mindset and attitude and tooling around a different architecture that embraces digital transformation and DevOps in the future versus fighting it because of that cadence mismatch is, I think, the foundational first step.
Russell?
I agree. I think, yeah, it's relevant to introduce the components of the continuous ATO into the DevSecOps lifecycle. Basically, the security should be part of the initial design and development and maintenance lifecycle of a system. The negative side of that is that once you start pulling in a lot of the system data that the machines are good at, you also have a problem where you might get to the point where you may have too much data. So you have to get to the point where you can identify and maybe prioritize certain inputs, certain conditions, so that that machine data can be turned into actionable results. And that's where having a tool that can assist you with going that route can really make or break it the success of your ATO. Ideally, you want to have some sort of maybe a single pane of glass type dashboard, which will let you see where you are, show you the inputs that have contributed to that specific decision, and maybe being able to see a full audit of the data that resulted in the decision. So, for example, if you're tracking a certain metric that is linked to a control, you should be able to look into the history of that metric and see if maybe the value has changed. Maybe it's been 1 for the last 5 years, and now it's 2 for the last 20 minutes, and that might be a potential indicator of something. So being able to have an effective continuous ATO is very data driven, but there needs to be an effective way to consolidate a lot of the data. And of course, that might also pose some additional resource requirements. Some of the people will probably need to be trained. If someone has mostly spent their time managing lists, will now really have to be more in the deciding factor of things, maybe analyzing the data streams and determining the priorities of certain ones, so that their time can be used more effectively. And of course, maybe learning about some of the automations and alerting to make sure that only the actionable results are reported, so that the false positives don't deviate from the value of the system.
So both of you are bringing up some things related to potentially basically changing the mindset of how people work. Right now, it's easy to say bring a horse to water, right? But how do we make them drink? So from a practitioner perspective, if you're sitting in the seat at a federal agency and you've got auditors coming in, what are the things you're doing to help them wrap their head around why doing it this way is better, why this is better for them, not just for your organization, but for them as an auditor? Because what I think would be wonderful is if people here can take that back, because these auditors are in many cases thinking the old school way. This is how I've always done it. This is the way I expect to see it. This is the way I'm accustomed to doing it. So what are the things that you guys would do if you were sitting in that seat and that auditor's coming in? What are you going to tell them?
I think the big thing is meet people where they are. You can't force technology down people's throats when they're not culturally ready for it. But I don't think this is one of those things where you got to eat the whole elephant all at once. So to give sort of an example on the reg scale side, take the continuous monitoring data you already have, bring it in and self-updates on paper. Whatever you can update is going to save you time and money, and you can expand on that over time. It gives you sort of a nice portal and a place to start. But rather than try to fight auditors like, hey, we're going to give you OSCAL and machine read it, like they don't want any of that. Like they're not going to do it. They're not going to listen to you. Maybe your experience is different, but I've never once been successful in convincing an auditor to change their mind on how they want to do something, right? They're going to operate the way they're going to operate, but if you have it in machine readable, it's just a transform to dump it to Word, to dump it to Excel, to dump it to Power BI. So whatever format is consumable for the audience you're trying to present to. The key is to get it in a flexible architecture in a place where you've got the data, you can start to make sense of it, and then you can give it to people in ways that they can consume it. And so I'm always big on don't eat the whole elephant at once, don't try to boil the ocean. Just try to find the short-term tactical wins and build on them till you're at a point where you're starting to steer the Titanic. The government doesn't make sharp turns normally, right? So you just kind of got to inch it a little bit at a time in ways that are really consumable, that add short-term value, because people also don't want to spend a bunch of money and wait several years to see an outcome. We're an impatient society, like we want stuff now, right? So find things you can do now that make a difference, but with a goal towards where you're trying to get and slowly work your way there.
Russell, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is spot on. One thing I also wanted to add is standardization, both within the agency and across agencies. I think being able to kind of streamline the approach. A lot of the systems, for example, right now are either have recently completed migration to the cloud or are in the process of moving, which is changing some of the models and the way that applications are deployed. There's a lot of value to be gained from standardizing a lot of the approaches and therefore standardizing the security models behind those implementations. So being able to come in at the right time when the agency is making system architecture changes, when new services are being introduced, and be able to build a security plan that reflects that, and then replicate it across multiple systems within the organization, or maybe even multiple systems outside of the organization, would allow you to have a more streamlined, more standardized approach. And I think from the compliance perspective, the decision makers will also like to see more consistent implementation. Having this machine-to-machine interface with standardized controls would probably have a significant impact on accuracy. Yeah, you might have occasional false positives once in a while, but you're also probably not omitting a ton of manual inputs an assessor might simply miss. Plus, I think from the assessment perspective, it might feel that the assessor actually has more access to the real data as it pertains to the system, as opposed to the highly interpreted results that were put together in the manual package in the past. So having this direct response from when the event is generated in the system to being reflected on some sort of a near real-time dashboard, to make it into like a poem based on the issues that are open and prioritized. I think by shortening that time frame, you also get a much better value as a decision maker.
So let me ask. So we've talked about this continuous component, right? Continuous monitoring, CATO. What are the challenges with bridging, right, this continuous piece into the processes as they exist today, right? So right now, everybody's got this ATO that they're working towards that's completely manual. What are the biggest challenges that practitioners are facing today, and how do they start just take some baby steps to get to that first phase of being continuous?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is a lot of the continuous monitoring tools weren't designed to directly attest to controls. So getting better mappings in those tools, embracing things like OSCAL that make it easier to do it is a big first step. And so if you want to accelerate progress, number one is just be able to take advantage of things you already have. If you're already using Tenable or Qualys or Rapid7 or pick a scanner, you should be able to take that data to update paperwork. Same with your configuration management tools like Ansible or SCCM or whatever you may be using. Most organizations are data rich. It's just a heavy manual copy and paste exercise and analysis exercise to get it into a Word document. So take the data you already have, try to bring it in. That helps with getting continuous. The other thing that, as an industry, we've got to get better at is embracing approaches where, I'll just say, stopping the standard proliferation. So if you got to meet 853, you're at 5, it'd be nice if you also didn't have to map to PCI, HIPAA, NERC SIP, all these other things that may wrap around it, SOC 2, ISO 27000. There's just so many frameworks out there. So when you talk about integrating, what you want to avoid is an end-to-the-end computer science problem where you're solving for two unknowns. Is a lot more difficult than being able to control one and then work off of that. So I think those are the big things, is trying to find a way to consolidate your controls and get a good mapping, and then tie that back to your continuous monitoring, access control, configuration management tools to self-update everything you can.
Oh.
My wife did not like my answer.
Russell, what are your thoughts? What are some of those challenges?
So I think continuous monitoring is key. We actually do a little bit of work where we take some of the security technical implementation guides for our DoD customers and build the continuous monitoring processes around them, where not only are we monitoring these systems, but actually implement mitigations for common vulnerabilities that may be identified. In our case, it's a continuous process that can that goes at a STIG level, sometimes beyond. Like, for example, we're encountering some cases where the STIGs may have been written for the on-prem version of the application, but say like a cloud implementation of the same product or service can be very different. We're building solutions that allows us to capture the change in configuration, immediately report it to a dashboard, prioritize the risk based on several attributes, so that they can create a work item. But at the same time, for the risks that are common and identifiable and for which there is a known solution, we actually try to programmatically address and immediately mitigate them and retest to make sure that it's been covered. And they're also updating our dashboard to say that a certain risk was identified and a certain risk was resolved. In our case, there's a lot of value in having the additional benefit of auditable data associated with each control, each specific vulnerability for a specific asset, so that we can go back in time and show our auditor and say that we've initially mitigated this vulnerability on such and such date. It's been fine up until a certain other date, and then we noticed as part of our continuous monitoring process that all of a sudden that vulnerability is open again. So we were able to report it immediately. We were able to mitigate it through code before an analyst could even look at it. The status was updated. The analyst confirmed that the issue was mitigated correctly, did some additional testing, and now the issue is resolved. And we can only get to that through highly integrated continuous monitoring processes that are part of your CI/CD pipeline, that are part of the scheduled events in your across all of your development, test, and production environments, to ensure that you can basically meet the increasing challenges that are coming today. And earlier, I sort of mentioned that a system today might be more complex than a similar system 5-10 years ago. Part of the challenge is also coming from, like earlier I mentioned about cloud service providers and the concept of shared responsibility model, where as a tenant in a cloud service provider's environment, you don't always have full control over some of these security controls, and therefore you have to rely on them. Many times you can test for it. You can test if the vulnerability exists, but you might not have enough tools at your disposal to actually mitigate it. So having an ability to capture those changes, act on them, and if possible, maybe even alert your commercial partner, that might be your cloud service provider, and let them know that there is an open vulnerability that only they can fix on a compressed schedule, would also significantly improve the security stance of your systems.
Very nice. So something, Travis, that you mentioned earlier, and Russell, as you were talking about the development processes and things. And so here's another poll, folks, if you could take that. One of the things you talked about was compliance as code. Now, when people think compliance, I know when I think compliance, it's like compliance with something or paperwork, right? It's right. But now you're talking about compliance as code. Walk people through what that looks like.
Yep. And so I'll start, and I'll refer back to NIST OSCAL as I think the gold standard in this space, especially for government. Dr. Alwarga's team at NIST has done a great job at looking at what are all the artifacts from your system security plan to your system categorization to your assessment plan, your assessment results, your POAMs that you're doing in Word and Excel today. Can we take that unstructured or lightly structured data and put it in a machine readable format, and not just one, make it machine readable in XML, YAML, or JSON, multiple versions. So we can now do a couple of things. We can share data amongst one another in highly reliable ways because it's against a standard that's tightly defined, right? So it's very structured data, very readable. So it makes interoperability easier. It makes portability easier. But where it's increasingly going to make things easier and where we're making investments in reg scale is in AI/ML. Because AI/ML is useful to the degree to which it can be accurate, right? In some things, you don't need it to be accurate. So if I'm just using ChatGPT to help with my kids' homework, it's not that important that it be accurate. I can look something up, and if it gets me in the ballpark, we'll call it good enough, and I'll figure it out from there. But if you're talking weapon systems for the DoD, it's highly important that it be accurate, right? And so to make these models more accurate, having a structured data source that they can learn from that's predictable is going to make these models mature a lot faster, right? And so I think there's multiple benefits to it, from machines attesting to machines about their state, portability, and a basis for AI/ML. You're really going to need three things to enable the future of RML. You're going to need standards like NIST OSCAL. You're going to need tools like RegScale that are sort of OSCAL native and API driven compliance as code. And then you're going to need service providers that can help you build that culture, bridge that cultural gap like a Caliber. And so it takes everybody working together to sort of fix the problem. But I think you're going to need all those things, but that compliance as code standards underpinning is foundation.
Russell, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a perfect approach. The only other things I wanted to add is we do a lot of, I guess, everything as code, infrastructure as code, security as code type integration throughout the entire lifecycle. Our goal is to implement the security vulnerability checks at just about every stage of our CI/CD pipeline and generate artifacts as part of each step. As we establish the baseline of the expected results, I think that's a big opportunity for the AI and ML that Travis has mentioned to look for the outliers, to basically look at, if you're always receiving a certain response from a certain action, and all of a sudden you start getting a different response, could this be a potential trigger that something is misconfigured or maybe something was overseen? So through the use of standardized CI/CD pipelines and standardized infrastructure as code type practices, we can ensure a more consistent implementation, but that by itself doesn't make it any more secure. It's really by assessing and looking for the changes throughout the lifecycle and identifying any variances where we can look for additional triggers to analyze some potential vulnerabilities as they get introduced. And having a real-time dashboard, real-time alerting in place allows us to prioritize and focus on those areas shortly after they become noticed, as opposed to with a traditional life cycle, it might be hours, days, weeks before you might be able to notice something that's different about your configuration.
Got it. So there are a number of things that I want to pull on, right? But as we think about digital innovation, if you take a step back to where we were, 5 years ago, this wasn't even a thought as it relates to, compliance as code, continuous ATO. These things were not conversation starters. These things were not something coming down the pike about to be mandated. 5 years out from now, what are you thinking where are we going to be then, right? If we are at this point right now where compliance as code is becoming a thing and it's going to be mandated, that, continuous ATO, right? Automation, shifting left. What does 5 years from now look like with the speed at which we've gone from physical servers and applications being these 3-tiered models to, you know, servers, code, the cloud? What does 5 years down the road look like as it relates to trying to meet something like the RMF?
My hope is that it goes similar to cloud. I remember the early days of cloud in 2008 or so, where we would talk about it and everybody would wear there's no such thing as cloud, it's other people's computers. Everybody complained about cloud. I'll never put my data in the cloud. And then you fast forward 15 years and it's the opposite. Every sysadmin is like, I don't want to run that on-prem. I don't want to deal with that. Can't we just buy a service, right? I'm hoping that this goes that same arc where you hit the resistance wall, but the forces of transformation are inevitable, right? So ideally, everybody's providing a service would align to a set of controls. They would express how to implement those controls in their software, ideally in something like OSCAL. Then your configuration tools would pick that up and they could auto put things into that state without any intervention of your own. Then scanners could pick up that config. They could go assess them against it, make sure you're compliant, remediate if you're not. And all this stuff can be handled much more machine to machine. And you're just looking for the outliers and the risky areas, and that it moves that way over time. And so I think, to me, that's inevitable. It has to. Otherwise, compliance processes and regulatory frameworks will always be the equal and opposite force to digital transformation if we don't move that way. Because it took forever to rack and stack servers, to get infrastructure, to get a procurement out. Increasingly, we can buy things through marketplaces, and we've got pre-approved cloud spend. We spin it up in seconds in the cloud with DevOps and Terraform and all those things. Now it's the paperwork that's the new long pole in the tent that's slowing everybody down. So to me, this is the next great industry challenge that we have to rally around as a community. You know, the standards folks, the tool vendors, and the services folks to, like, what's a better answer for the government? How do we best enable that mission to go execute at the speed it needs to without compromising in any way on our security? And if we do it right, I would argue it's going to actually enhance our security.
I can agree with that. Russell, what are your thoughts? What's 5 years look like from your perspective?
So with the focus shifting on some of the newer emerging technologies like large language model, more prevalence of ML in the typical life cycle, things like blockchain or even quantum computing, without any doubt, that's going to introduce all sorts of additional security tools to support those technologies. And as a result, we'll probably end up with a much bigger stream of input data coming from those scanning tools. So I think this is where automation is going to become even more important. If your team is able to process to do the log analysis, look through the security artifacts right now, with the way the system is right now, you might not be able to scale to the new requirements 5 years from now, where you will have more reporting systems, more data inputs that need to be processed in real time and need to be acted upon, prioritized, deprioritized, considered to be false positive, etc. So I think this is where automation is going to play an even bigger role, and having a flexible tool that will take your input correlated to maybe a vulnerability, correlated to a security control, update your artifacts, whatever those might be in relation to your ATO or in relation to your RMF package, and act on those things and do it in real time, ideally without significant interaction from the actual person maintaining that process. So more automation, more decision-making that's automated, more reliance on historical data for real-time analysis using AI and ML, so that some of the easy decisions can be made by the computer, and then maybe subsequent decisions can be reviewed by an analyst. So this way you'll have a best combination of taking what the machines do best on a large scale, and then prioritizing the important decisions to the analysts. And hopefully that will also, instead of decreasing the quality of life for the people responsible for those systems and decision processes, will actually make job easier, when all you have to do is come in and review the incremental changes, not have to look through the entire set of scans generated by your scanning system and trying to find any variance from day to day.
So a lot of what you guys are saying are taking me back 20 years, right? So for those who haven't been around a while, a little over 20 years ago, this thing called the SIM came to market, right? Where we had gotten so much data that, security teams could no longer look at all the data and sift through logs of all the different systems that were logging information. And it became overwhelming. And so SIMs were created. And it sounds like we've gotten to the point where data is so massive at this point now, from a compliance standpoint, and the data that has to be gathered and put together and sifted through, that we're taking another leap forward here for compliance. Would you guys agree with that? Is this a similar sort of panacea moment?
Yeah, I think there's a time and a place for everything, and a lot's market timing. So one of our large customers called us a SOC for compliance. And it's this idea that rather than just point in time, we should be able to have observability of everything. It's not dissimilar to what you're trying to do from security operations. The only difference is what you're looking for is compliance violations, where are things misconfigured, and trying to surface that as rapidly as possible. And then similar to where SOAR took fire immediately after, remediated as quickly as possible, right? So it's really the same flow into a different problem domain, but it's always been difficult because there was no standards-based way to do it.
Right.
It's always been difficult because, unlike the SOC, where everything's machine enforced for the most part, a huge part of compliance is humans. But when you look at the rise of cloud, the amount of data we have, and the speed at which AI is learning, all those things are coming together in such a way that it's going to allow us to do things that would have been black magic and witchcraft 5 years ago. Like nobody would have believed it's possible. But now you can cobble those things together, and pretty sure soon you'll be able to count on them. And pretty soon after that, it'll be a poker ante or table stakes. You won't even think about it. It'll just be the way it's done.
Yeah. What about you, Russell? What do you think?
So I think there's another dimension of complexity that we're adding compared to where we were 20 years ago. And that would be the architecture of the systems done today relies so much on the third-party components, third-party systems. And as a product owner, you might not always know what components your systems are residing on. So this is where software bills of materials come into play, and being able to actually have some sort of a framework that identifies what components you're using, be able to compare it against the known risks associated with those products, and be able to act on it. I mean, thinking back to the Log4j incident, about a year and a half ago, where all these organizations were basically caught without realizing that their commercial enterprise products were using Log4j library, and there was a known vulnerability, and without having the right tools at their disposal, they could not really correlate the risks associated with those vulnerabilities. So being able to introduce that as part of your workflow adds a lot of value, but also generates a lot of data. And we get to the point where if you can't handle the number of inputs coming in right now, you certainly won't be able to handle it 5 years from now, especially with the high reliance on cloud services, a lot of standardization, a lot of reusable components across multiple systems within the same organization or beyond. So being able to process all that data and act on it quickly with proper priorities on the risks, I think is going to be very relevant.
Yeah, that piece right there, the SBOM piece, I think is an added gotcha moment, right? Where, whether it be SolarWinds or to your point, that Log4j vulnerability, a lot of people sort of had a oh my moment when that happened. So we've got another poll question up for everyone, if you could please answer that. So we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to leave some time for people to ask questions, but I've got at least one, if not a couple more questions for you guys. So with that, with all this data, with us, sort of reaching this moment of panacea, with the threat landscape, as you mentioned it, Russell, changing so rapidly, the number of attacks that we're getting hit with, the data sprawl, because we've got so much data coming at us and being stored in a myriad of places that in many cases we might not know about, as the business is moving at the speed of light, and security and regulations and compliance is trying to keep up. What is that thing that you would tell people to go do today, right, to try and start down this path of meeting the needs of the RMF? Like, what is that first action that they need to go take away right now?
I think for me, 2023 is going to be remembered as the year that's the start of the AI wars, where AI is going to attack, AI is going to defend. And if you're relying on people to create and read paper, to understand your posture, you're fighting a losing battle. So I think the number one takeaway for me is get into a state where machines are talking to machines about their states. You can understand your posture in as close to real time as possible. We can already react to incidents in near real time. That's where we've all invested in security operations centers and other things. But posture things are the things that kill us because we think we're in a state and we're not. And the quicker you know that you're not in the state you hope to be in, the better off you're going to be because you can take immediate action on it. So I think moving the RMF forward to make it real time, compliance as code, to prepare yourself for what's coming is the thing everybody should start inching towards. And it's not going to be something that happens overnight. It's going to be one of those things where you've got to make baby steps towards the goal. And pretty soon you won't believe how good you are. But I think it's one of those real-time posture assessment, knowing where you're at and being able to react is always going to be the key to good security. But if you don't know what you have and the posture that you're in, it becomes very difficult to defend it.
Agreed. Russell.
I think also one other benefit that Travis sort of started on, but did not quite finish his thought, was also maybe cross-functional, cross-team collaboration on some of the risk management activities. A lot of times, the security activities are handled as stovepipes assigned to a specific system or a specific group or directorate within the organization without high-level real-time oversight. Being able to see some of the same threat patterns appear across multiple systems on the same dashboard or in the same type of data repository would also allow for decision makers to act quicker. Because yeah, like Travis has said, our enemy is going to be moving a lot faster with the addition of some of those ChatGPT style like large language model and various rootkits and packages that are becoming more widely available. So the agencies don't just need to plug one hole for a specific system, but really address it at a more enterprise level. And in order to be able to make some of those decisions, I think it's going to be very important to have a high level real-time or near real-time view of your security stance and having the right tools in place, having the right automations, having the right processes, and more important, having the right training for the personnel to ensure that those tools utilized correctly is what's going to get us there.
I love it. So I've got a question from Momo Hadi. And Travis, I'm going to push this one to you. And it's suggestions on tracking the frequency of controls being assessed. So what they mean is, how do I know what controls I need to assess based on a specific date? And can that be done with RegScale?
Short answer is absolutely. So we kind of follow that OSCAL hierarchy, sort of catalog, profile, SSP, control, then SAP SAR underneath it. So based on that, we look at every control and say, basically, what's our continuous monitoring requirement? Maybe it's annual, maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's every 3 years. It varies by customer. And then we look at the controls and you can schedule them in continuous monitoring to get assessed. But also if you're assessing them with any of our commercial integrations, it's just going to tell you the date it was last assessed and which ones are overdue or coming due for assessment. So it tries to put a lot of automation and dashboarding and visibility around it to make that process easier for conducting your continuous monitoring and making sure you're doing continuous controls assessment versus once every 3-year point in time, which many government agencies are still doing.
Thank you, sir. One for you, Russell. So will ZTA accelerate or hinder the shift to continuous ATO?
Well, it's clear that zero trust architecture is the next buzzword, especially across the government and DoD customers. I do think that there's a lot of value in ZTA implementation, but I don't know if there's been, I know recently there's been some policy published regarding specific implementation criteria, but I haven't seen any implementations or lessons learned. So I think the process itself is evolving. From the perspective of will it hinder the CATO? I don't think it will hinder it per se, but it will probably introduce some additional complexities in a sense that your continuous monitoring, continuous assessment platform needs to be aware and well updated on the changes introduced by the ZTA. If you have non-permanent configurations for certain assets, for example, you would need to make sure that your control processes and your security scanners and whatever else generates data input is aware of that architecture so that you can make the right decisions. And as a result, it will probably increase the complexity of implementation and therefore maybe increase some of the amount of work that needs to be done in support of the CATO. But I think in the long run, it will probably benefit us.
Agreed. One more question, and Travis, this one will go to you. Russell, you may know based on some of the customers you work with, but they say currently, this is from Mike Hunnelt. I hope I said that properly. Currently, we're going through the final phase of our triennial ATO. After this, HQ is looking to transition to continuous monitoring phase. Do you know if any government entities have looked into and or have implemented something like the RegScale tool?
The short answer is absolutely. This is actually an area where I think government is leading industry a little bit, where they've got more significant threats. And because of that, they're allocating more resources in a more forward-leaning way. So we have, and I don't want to drop specific agencies, but multiple DoD customers that are very much thinking continuous control monitoring, continuous ATO. Also, the DoD CIO dropped a memo saying thou shalt. And so that's forcing some things in that direction. We've got multiple of the large federal civilian agencies that are looking at the end of a GRC contract for a legacy provider and saying, how do we get to continuous ATO and zero trust, and using that as an opportunity to make different decisions. And then the third thing I would say is Gartner and some of the analysts have clued into there's something beyond GRC and IRM, and they're starting to talk about continuous controls monitoring, continuous controls assessment, and writing market guides and other things. So it would be nice if RegScale was the only tool in the world that does this. Unfortunately, there's several. And I think, you can start doing your market research with your analysts to kind of see what's out there, who's got an interesting take on this, and who's best optimize their solution for the needs of the government. My personal opinion is there's several in this space, but a lot of them have sort of optimized for private sector use cases, and they will struggle with the complexity and scale of government. The RegScale approach has been start with the most extreme side of government, working with partners like Caliber, and then solving for private sector will be easy as a function of that. And so I do your own market research, not listen to vendors like me, but there's several in this space for sure.
Great. So I've got another question. So how do delays, and this is from John Sochan, how do delays in DoD adopting OSCAL support in EMAS affect its usability in the near term?
Yeah, I can take that one at a high level and see if Russ wants to add in. What we're finding is a lot of folks are pushing the boundaries of continuous ATO. Maybe you got a software factory in DoD and you're trying to go high-end DevOps, and then you run into the EMAS wall and everything slows back down and becomes a feed the monster manual process. RegScale, our approach is we do OSCAL, we do everything API driven. We'll just generate automated EMAS exports. And so if you still need to feed EMAS, we'll give you an easy button to feed EMAS. If you still need to feed CSAM, we can give you an easy button to feed CSAM. But the goal is to kind of meet people where they are. And so if that's what you need to do, we can help you with that reality today, but we can also we can bolt onto them to add additional value where there's nothing wrong with, EMAS and some of these other tools. They were just built for a different time and place and may not necessarily be architected for a cloud native API real-time world, and certainly weren't built on OSCAL, which came a decade or more after they were built. So retrofitting things into that's a lot harder than starting from scratch. So frankly, we had a little bit easier job. So we can complement that and automate the feeds for folks who still need it.
Russ, you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think EMAS interface specifically is a very good point of interest for a number of our customers, especially in the DoD sector. It's OSCAL might not be the only way to get the data in there. And I know current implementation of XScale does support data export of multiple artifacts into data formats that are indeed acceptable to by EMAS. I know from interfaces of my security teams that data entry into EMAS can be very time consuming. So having an automated interface in place that supports current EMAS capabilities is better than having nothing. And I think from that, even there, if you're taking a task that will take you 6 hours to update and converting it into a 5-minute process, then you already saved yourself a lot of time that you can better allocate towards actual assessment work as opposed to data entry. Will OSCAL support, will there be support for OSCAL and EMAS? I don't know about it. I would like to see that it will be a more open system. I don't know anything specific about their implementation capabilities they want to implement in the near future, but it would certainly be great if there is more of a native interface so that data sharing to EMAS can be more of a fully automated event as opposed to a set of steps that have to be manually initiated at this time.
Thanks, Russ. So I've got another question. This gentleman says, I am pursuing a cybersecurity certificate from ISC Squared. Would starting in the risk management framework be a good place to apply?
I think starting
Either
with
of you can
this,
jump on that.
yeah, I think my take on that is, starting with RMF and NIST is always kind of the high watermark. So if you're in 853 world and you can get your arms around that, then going downstream to NIST CSF or ISO 27000 or SOC 2 or pick another framework, they're all largely the same. They're a collection of best practices that say you should generally try to do these things. Just the 853 is larger, more prescriptive. So
Right.
The upside of starting there is, everything else will be easier. The downside of picking that one to start is you'll have the largest learning curve up front.
Yeah, I'll echo that one, right? So starting with 853, it's the largest control set that exists. And it literally maps to everything else, like literally, and there are tons of mapping tools that you can go out there and find that'll show you, and it will begin the teachings of everything else you need across every regulation and every other possible framework that exists. So everything is a derivative of it. So I think that's the best place to start. Let's see, I think we have one more question. Nope, that is it. So that's the last question. We are approaching time. So I'm going to do one thing that I like to do at the end of my webinars. For each of you, if you had one sentence, right, to give to people on this webinar today that they could take back to their organization, one catchphrase, one thing that they can use to go in and get people excited to start this journey in this process, what would it be? And Travis, I'm gonna let you go first.
Yeah, what I used to tell people when I was on the federal side is people would dump these 600-page SSPs in front of me, and I would joke, they hired me to lead, not to read. And so I think getting out of this write once, read never to get more actionable data, because it's soul sucking. Like when you're in cyber, you have a purposeful life, because what you do in cyber protects our way of life. Almost no company or organization can run without the best technology today. And so cyber people are at the forefront of that. So what I would say is this is a chance to make cyber more enjoyable. Let's fix the parts of it that we don't like, so that we can do the parts of it that give you a purposeful life, and help you secure the things you're asked to secure.
Russell.
And for me, I think standardization, automation, and auditability are key components for the successful cybersecurity strategy. Having the right tool or framework in place to help you get there is what's going to make it successful.
Great. I want to thank the both of you for joining us on this webinar today. I'm going to pass it back over to the Caresoft team. Maher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Larry, Travis, and Russell. I want to thank all of our participants as well as our speakers for being with us today.